Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to be looking at OpenSSH again. This time I'm going to be looking at key management, but more specifically, we're going to be looking at host and user certificates. Stay tuned right after this. So I wanted to spend a little time today to talk about key management, but I'm going to call this video OpenSSH Host and User Certificates because I'm not going to talk about the full gamut of how to manage certificates because that's a complex subject and we'd be here for hours. It suffices to say that key management is really about improving the security of your SSH servers and your clients that are being used to access those servers. I had a comment on my last video from one of my viewers that said, I can't wait to see how bad my key management skills are. I don't want you to feel that way at all because in technology, I could tell you all about this today and then a month from now, something new comes out. Well, in fact, there is something new out, and we're going to touch on that before the end of this video. But there's always better ways to do things, and just get used to feeling stupid because that's going to happen to you. As new things come out, and as you learn of them, you find out there are better ways to do it than the way you initially proposed to do something a few years back. I don't have a study that says how many people think that public key authentication is better than using passwords, but I think it's pretty well accepted that passwords are on their way out. At least I think passwords, the best thing to do with them is to just dump them on the heap of history and forget about them. They are not really something that's workable in this day and age. They're susceptible to key logging. They because of the nature of having to do multiple attempts to allow users to enter their passwords before either you invalidate the session for a period of time or you make them go contact an admin. But yeah, they're just not good mechanisms to handle ways of accessing our servers today. Public key authentication is a step up, but it has their own set of issues, and one of the weaknesses, particularly with SSH, is trust on first use, or TOFU, and not that TOFU. So I think today, though, TOFU is really is not an ideal situation. It's tolerated on SSH mainly because there's just there's a relatively few people who use it, and that would be in comparison to the number of people that access the servers via the web. But TOFU doesn't work very well for SSH. It has a couple of major weaknesses, and the first one is TOFU provides a prompt on the initial connection to a server by a client for the very first time. It'll ask you, do you want to, this is an unknown server, do you want to accept this connection? Well, how would a user know if that key that was being issued to it is valid or not? You have no idea. So guess which way a user is probably going to answer that question the majority of the time is going to be, yeah, I'll accept the connection. So if the key were tainted, was replaced, then that user would now be vulnerable to attack because that person on that server would be able to see the unencrypted traffic that was coming from that user. So yeah, not a good thing. The second problem is on subsequent connections that initial host key is cached in your known host file. And on subsequent connections, the user has to manually determine the validity of any key that conflicts with that cache key. So yeah, SSH is going to make a comparison between the two, and then it's going to issue the dreaded warning. If somebody may be doing something nasty, or they may come back and say someone has compromised your DNS server. There's a number of just frightening, totally frightening error messages that come back that deny the system to the access to that user. And we consider that back in the day as bricking the server. The other problem is that, again, just like the initial connection, just because you get a request that the key is invalid between the validity of the key is suspect between the server and the client. Doesn't mean the client's wrong. It could mean that someone has replaced the host key with one that's tainted. So you got the same issue, right, as you had before, is that you could leave the user in a vulnerable position for attack. This is not, I'm not saying that this is a be-all, end-all, great solution to all your problems. It isn't, because even SSH certificates have their own problems. So, but the best practice is to use SSH certificates in the event of nothing else being available to you. The problem is that most of the SSH certificates that I'm going to show you today, this would be similar to a lightweight PKI. This does not have the auditing that you would normally have in a full PKI, like you would with an SSL TLS certificate that was issued by a public trust, because then you can trace back the chain of trust to the root authority, and you know that key had gone through an audit and had been properly issued. But in this method, all you have is a signed certificate by your internal host, and you have to trust that internal host has not been compromised. That's why you have to be very careful with your host CA that you don't allow those keys to escape. So anyway, it's a step up, all right? It's a step up from public key authentication, and it was added to OpenSSH in 5.4. That's about 10 years ago, so it's been around. OpenSSH now allows the creation of SSH certificates. Those certificates require a certificate authority to issue and cryptographically sign the certs. So at least you have a fingerprint on that particular key when it's handed to the user, that there is some mechanism to at least say, yes, this has been put through the signing process within the organization, and that's all you can say about it, right? The issued and signed certificates that can then be used to authenticate the host to the users, because remember, there's a two-way pipe here that occurs. You have to authenticate the host to the users, and then you have to authenticate the users to the host. That's the way SSH works. So yeah, that facilitates both mechanisms. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to create the host certificate for that we're going to use for the CA. And it's the same mechanism you use to create any key on whether it be for the initial host certificate or whether it's the user certificate. It's the same mechanism. You use SSH keygen, you pass a -T to tell it which cryptographic method you want to use. You pass it a -B that tells you the key strength. In this case, because these keys are longer lived, this would be a higher strength. 4096 is the example here. And then the name of the key, -F, and then a -C, that's a comment. And that's used to later come back and identify, some information about that key as to what it's being used for. So in our case, this is the one that we're going to pull the private key and use that to sign all of our host certificates with. So like any other certificate, you want to keep the private key a secret. Don't give it out to anyone. This is where one time we had a client that had installed an LDAP server. They were trying to move it further down the road to being able to provide single sign-on support for the organization. So there was some other pieces in there that they were doing, but they needed a mechanism to issue the SSH keys out to those users that were admins, right, or developers, so they could have access to a telnet session on the box, or a terminal session on the box. So their answer to it was to take the private key and the public key and publish them in the LDAP. And when we first heard that, I remember it wasn't just my jaw that hit the table. It was just about every other person that was in the room. They were just like, what? So the first question out of my mouth was, and how are you going to protect the private key? Oh, we're going to encrypt it. Second question out of my mouth was, and how long is this key good for? And they said, 10 years. And I was like, okay, so you're going to give a potential adversary 10 years to crack that key because it won't change in that 10 years. and you're going to give them 10 years to crack it. I said, do you want to be the person that has to stand in front of one of the higher ups and explain to them why their servers were all compromised? Their email now was being sent by someone other than them, and explain to them why that happened. And they were like, what do you mean? I don't think they understood. I don't think that to this day they ever got why that. We turned them down. We said no. But I still don't think those people ever got what was the problem with their approach. So yeah, don't ever give your private key out, ever. If you want to put the public key in your LDAP server, that's fine, but don't put your private key there. Find another method to get the private key onto the box with the user. So ideally, yeah, so a little bit more further down the road is that ideally the access to your host CA server should be restricted. You don't want to have just anybody being have access to it. So you may want to pull it off the network, or you may want to put it on a network that is maybe only accessible by a host that handles an automated process to make requests, to generate new keys, and to send them out via some mechanism to the requesting person that's asking for it. But yeah, I mean, and make sure that you validate that that person should be one that can ask for that to happen. But yeah, and you might want to automate the process of generating the host and the user certs as well. So yeah, the second best practice is to separate the user and the host and the user CA. And that means that you would have a host certificate authority and a user certificate authority. Well, why would you do that? Well, it's just not a good idea to use the same process to sign a host certificate as one that signs the user certificate. No, that's not smart. Don't do that. You want to use separate CAs, and that gives you an advantage because in the event that a private key is compromised, maybe it's your host key on your server that got compromised, I only need to reissue that. I don't have to worry about then having the TOFU message of death appear on all my client screens because the fact that it's still signed will validate it with the client. So it'll continue. Even though it's changed, that validation is still in place. So the other thing is that if the user private key becomes compromised, I don't have to reissue my host certificates along with it. I can just reissue the client user, and then I don't have to do both. So you can create user certificates the same mechanism you use to create the host certificates. You pass it the -T, give it the cryptographic method, the -B, the key strength or the key length in bits. -F is the ID of the file, and then a -C is a comment, again, to identify it later on. Again, same thing. Private key on the user should be kept secret. Don't let it out. So once we have the host CA pair, the private and the public, we can create our host keys from that. And the way we do this, again, is with SS Keygen. We're going to go ahead and create our key, and you'll notice that I'm passing a -N. That's the passphrase. And I'm just putting a single quote in it with nothing, so it's a null string, to basically say I don't want a passphrase, and then I give it the same other information otherwise. And that will then create my public and private keys for the host. I don't have them signed yet. That's the next thing we want to do here, and that's to sign the key for the host. And to do that, I do the SSH Keygen again. This time I pass it a -S and give it the name of the private key for the host CA. -I, I'm giving it the host name that it goes with, but that's just a comment that gets put in the key. Then a -H, that says that designates this as a host key, not a user key, and that's required. And then a -N, this is the host that it will be validated for that key. That's the only host that's allowed. Yes, there's probably some wildcards you can use for this, but I would recommend it. I always did things point to point because that was the rules and where I came from on the security was you do everything point to point. -V, 52 weeks. SSH host RSA key pub is the public key that we're signing. So yeah, and that'll be valid. That certificate will be valid for a year. You should then have 3 files. Now you can set that to whatever length of time you want. Maybe a year is too long for your organization. maybe your organization policy is to make it longer. But just know this, that those, most of the time, nobody changes the host keys, at least not unless they're required to. But this will require you to change it because they will expire. So you copy these three to your server's etc SSH directory. Now, you might want to pay attention to your particular host. It may put them in a different location, but in Linux, generally, it's in etc SSH. So you'll want to edit your SSH deconfig file, and that needs an extra line added to it, and that identifies which key is the host certificate. So you put in host certificate and then identify the file with a full path name to do that. Then you just restart the SSHD, and you're not quite ready to make an attachment connection based on that host key. You still got one other thing you need to do, and that's for each client. Sorry, but each client's got to have an indication to present that they're asking for the host key. And so here, you just edit your known host file. You insert the host CA's public key into that file. This has nothing to do with the user key. This is the CA's public key. Don't put the private key in here. Put the public key in here. And then in front of that, you'll want to have @cert-authority. And then there's a wildcard on this one. It's anything in the domain example.com. So you can also put hosts with a comma delimited format in here to identify a string of hosts, or that key is good for. You can also use IP addresses, again, comma delimited. And then, your key follows it. This identifies this particular system as where to validate the host CA. And and then remove any entries in that known host file for that existing server. And then you should be all good to go once you do. User certificates. So again, we want to generate the user key for a user. Now, you can copy one of your existing ones in. You can do the same on your host. I'm going to generate my user keys here, and then we'll take that and we'll use that to sign using the host CA certificate that we just created. So I'm going to use a -s. This is the private key for the user CA. -i is just a comment. I'm putting in the my address, email address here for the server, and then -n is the user that is being authenticated with that key. You can have a comma delimited list of users in here if you wish. So if I were to have multiple accounts, I might be associated with the same key. Also, you'll want to have an expiration date on that. You may consider your user keys too old if they go a year long. You may consider it too young. Maybe you want it a little longer. So you can set that to where you want. User-key.pub is the public key that you're assigning. And you will end up with 3 files: the user key pub that were generated during the user key process, and then the third one, which was just added when we signed the key, which is the key-cert.pub. I'll need to copy those, all 3 of them, over to my .ssh directory in order for them to work. Now, to get to them, I need to go back to my SSH server and tell them I need to copy my user CA pub file over to the SSH server SSHD directory. So SSH directory, and then I'll need to edit my SSHD config and add TrustedUserCAKeys and point to /SSHuser_CA.pub, and then restart the server. That's it. I'm done. At this point, I have a system that is using host certificates for the host to user authentication, and I've got user certificates that are handling the user to host authentication. So I'm done. So at this point, I should be able to replace keys on either end. Additional, if it's set up correctly, and you'll want to make sure in your logs that you are. Some additional best practices that you might consider. You might consider forcing all your SSH connections through a Bastion host. Don't confuse a Bastion host with an SSH proxy or an SSH jump server. They're quite different. The other one is you might consider two-factor SSH authentication. Two-factor can also be multi-factor. So again, I don't know whether I'm going to do a future video on those. If that's of interest to you, I can certainly do it. However, the other thing you might consider is Teleport as a replacement for OpenSSH. Teleport is a open source project, and they do have a commercial version for enterprise. We set up a SSH CA server. We created our host CA keys. We created our host CA user keys for the CA, and we also created a host key and we signed it. We configured our SSH server to accept those host certificates, and showed you how to configure the SSH client to accept those host certificates. We created our user key and we signed it with our user CA private key. And we configured our SSH server to accept user certificates. So we now have a full range of trust user certificates from host to user, user to host. So that's all I had, and yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this video today. I didn't want to make a demo out of it simply because I just don't think people are really that interested in watching me keyboard fumble. But if you feel differently, leave me a comment below. And also let me know if you want me to do a video on Teleport, the replacement for OpenSSH. And I'll try to get that done for you. But other than that, that's all I had for today. Please like and subscribe. Hope to see you all again real soon. And bye for now.